Hello and welcome to this lecture, and in this lecture we are going to talk something about object-oriented programming. So object-oriented programming is like a programming methodology like functional programming. So in functional programming we define our code in terms of functions, and we actually pass in data or function to other function, and functions actually return some value. So similar to functional programming, we have a concept which is called as object-oriented programming. And what object-oriented programming means is that we need to have certain classes in our code, and we need to put up the code or the functions in those classes. So according to object-oriented programming, we should have certain classes, and in those classes we should have some data, and we should have some functions which are called as the methods of those class. So instead of calling them functions in object-oriented programming, we call them as methods of that particular class. Now there are a few concepts which we are going to learn in object-oriented programming. The very first and important concept which we are going to talk about is going to be the class. So after learning about class, we are going to learn what are the attributes of a class or properties of a class. And then after going through the properties, the next thing which we are going to learn are the methods. So we are going to learn what all methods are present in a class and how to actually write a method in a particular class. Then once we have learned how to create a class, the next thing which we are going to learn is we are going to learn what are objects and how to create objects of a particular class. Now if this thing is overwhelming for you, then you absolutely don't need to worry, because we are going to go through these concepts one by one. So let's first understand what is actually a class. So if you forget about programming for a while, and if you actually define class is nothing but it is actually a classification of a particular thing. So in our society, people are actually classified according to their profession. So we actually have classified peoples as doctors, lawyers, engineers, accountants, business people, etc. So what class actually does is that it actually classifies a set of things in a particular way. So now let's learn how to create a basic simple class in Python. So the very first thing which you need to do to create a class is you need to type in the class keyword, which states that this particular thing is a class. So after typing the keyword class, you actually need to define the name of that particular class. So let's say we want to define a class which is called as students. So I'm going to type in students here, and after typing in the class name, you actually need to have colon over here, and the code for your class is going to be contained right after this colon when you hit enter. So the next thing which we need to do is that we actually need to define the properties of the class. Now let me tell you what are actually properties of a particular class. So let's assume that we are talking about professional people, and you divide professional people depending upon their class. So some are engineers, some are doctors, and some are lawyers. So each of that profession is going to have certain attributes. For example, if you talk about engineers or programmers for that matter, so the people who belong to the programmer class are actually going to have a set of attributes like their name, their location, the languages which they know, the platforms which they work on, and etc. So all those things which actually define a class are nothing but the properties or attributes of that particular class. So if you imagine a general student, the student is going to have a name, and let's assume that he's going to have a contact number. So actually a student might have a lot more parameters, a lot more attributes or properties, but for the sake of simplicity, we are going to consider only two attributes of a student, and that is nothing but his name and his contact information. So now you need to define the attributes of a class. So in order to define that, you type in def, and we are essentially going to create a function which is called as the init function to define the attributes. So whenever you actually want to define attributes or properties of any class, you need to use this init function. So after typing in def, you use double underscore, which is also called as dunders, and when you type those dunders, you are actually going to get the init function. So if you simply hit enter, as you could see, it is actually going to create the init function for you. So the significance of this init function is that it is actually used to initialize your objects when you create objects of those class. So we are going to learn objects of a particular class after a few time, but for now just understand that you actually need to define attributes in this init function right here. So as you might notice, there is actually a parameter present over here which is called as self. Now you actually need to go ahead and define other parameters for your student class. So as I said, the student is going to have a name and he is going to have contact information. So once you have passed in these parameters, the next thing which you need to do is that you actually need to initialize those parameters. So in order to initialize those, you simply type in self dot name equals name, and after this type in self dot contact equals contact. So once you are done that, you are pretty much good to go. So we are going to learn what this all means in the upcoming lectures, but this is not important as of now. So once you are done with this, you are pretty much done defining the attributes of your class. Now the next thing which you need to do here is that you actually need to go ahead and you actually need to define the methods of your class. So once you have defined the attributes over here, the next thing which you need to define is nothing but the methods which you want to use in this particular student class. So the methods are the one which are going to hold the code for this particular class. So once we have the attributes of student, let's say we want to perform some operation on the student. So let's say we actually want to accept the data of a particular student. So for accepting that data, we need to write in some code. So we are going to put in that code in something which is called as methods. So methods are nothing but when you actually write functions inside a class, those are actually called as methods of that class. So we simply define methods by typing def, then the method name. So first thing which we are going to do is that we are going to accept data. So we simply type in get data. So the method name in this case is get data, and by default you need to pass in self to this method right here. And now let's type in print and let's type in accepting data, and let's say that you actually want to accept the name and the contact info of that particular student. So what you need to do now is that you need a way to accept data from the user and store it into these attributes right here. So in order to save the name, you type in self.name, and then you could type in equals input, and in input you could type in enter name right over here. So this is essentially going to accept the name value from the user and it is going to store it into the name variable. Now same is the case with contact. So let's type in self dot contact equals input, and let's type in enter contact. So what this code essentially does is that it is going to accept the name and the contact details from the student, and it is going to store it into the attributes which we have defined here, and those attributes are nothing but the name and contact details of that particular student. So what this get data method actually does is that it takes in the data and it stores that data into these attributes right here. So once we have the method to get the data, let's also go ahead and create a method to put the data, that is to display the data. So let's type in def put data, and you could actually name your method as anything, but I'm taking the get data and put data names so as to make it more understandable. And what this is going to do is that it is essentially going to print out the data which is accepted. So you simply need to type in print, and you need to display that the name is, and here you actually pass in self dot name in order to display name, then give a comma, and again in quotations type in this is the contact, and here to display contact we type in self dot contact. So now once we are done with these two methods, we are pretty much done designing the student class. So as you could see, our student class actually has three things. The first thing which we need to do in any class is to define the attributes of the class. So attributes of a class are nothing but properties. So the student class actually has name and contact as properties. Now after attributes, the class actually consists of methods. So the methods are nothing but they are actually functions which we define in a particular class, and we have defined two functions or two methods, that is the getData method, which is used to get the data, and putData method, which is used to print out the data. So once we have these two things, the next thing which you need to do is that we need to actually go ahead and create the object of this class right here. So now let's learn what is an object creation. So as I already mentioned that classes are nothing but they are actually like a template. So for example, if you talk about general students, there could be a lot of students in this world right here. So in a similar fashion, in Python there could be any number of students, and you need to talk about a specific student because you are dealing with the specific details, that is the name of a specific student and the contact of that specific student. So in order to define a specific student, you need to create a specific object of this class right here. So in order to define a specific object, or rather to create an object, you need to type in some object name. So let's say we are defining this data for a particular student named John. So I'm going to simply type in JOHN, and then we are going to type this equals and the class name, which is students. So what this is essentially going to do is that it is going to create a new object which is now called as John. So John is actually one of the object of the student class. So you could say that John is one of the students right here. Now what you need to do is that you need to access these methods by using the object which is called as John. So whenever you actually want to call in this method or this function, what you need to do is that you need to type in John.getData to basically get information about John, and John.putData to actually display out the information about John. So now once you have this code, if you save this code and if you run it, so we have an error over here, and what you actually need to do is that while initializing the object, you need to pass in some data by default to this init function right here. So let's say the first parameter name is going to be blank, and let's give a comma, and let's say by default contact is going to be 0. So once you have this, and once you save the code, and when you run it once again, as you could see, it is going to accept the data. So enter name. So I'm going to type in the name as John, and I'm going to enter the contact as some random number. And when I hit enter, as you could see, we got the result as the name is John and the contact information is this right here. So that was the basic example explaining you the object-oriented programming. So this might be a little bit confusing for you, but remember that in object-oriented programming, we define the code in terms of data, which is nothing but the attributes of this particular class, and the methods, which are nothing but the code which we write to manipulate the data. So once we have this class defined, we simply go ahead and create objects of these classes right here, and then we use these objects to access the methods which are present in that particular class. So if you don't understand object-oriented programming, or if you are still having any issues understanding it, then please go ahead and feel free to ask me in the Q&A section, or you could also directly message me and I will be there to help you out. But make sure that you understand this concept properly, because we are going to widely use this in the upcoming lectures as well. So thank you very much for watching this lecture, and I'll see you guys in the next lecture. Thank you.